Much of our series on the pre-Christian teachings of Jesus, of Yeshua, have focused on his context in the place of first century Judaism and the ideas of first century Judaism in order to understand what he was saying. But Yeshua was also a great innovator. He was a genius. He was much more than a rabbi or a sage of his era or a prophet of his era. He took the teachings of Judaism into a whole new dimension and applied them to all humanity. And we're going to look at how he did that in this series. We're going to look at how Yeshua derived the teaching of love, blessing, and prayer for enemies. Unlike other Jewish sages, Yeshua brought forth many new kinds of teachings that derived from Jewish teachings, but were then universalized in the way he taught them. He was a charismatic reinterpreter of the Messianic Basor of John the Baptist to include all humanity. And unlike other Jewish sages, he was a critic of the Jerusalem temple establishment like John the Baptist and made powerful enemies as a Galilean sage. He was a peripatetic teacher. He walked. He didn't just sit in one place and have his students come to him. He went around all of Palestine on peripatetic preaching missions accompanied by a retinue of chosen disciples, not disciples who had applied to him, but people who, according to the gospel accounts, he himself had called forth, people who were fishermen in the Galilee. Unlike other Jewish sages, or very few other Jewish sages, he was a healer, also an exorcist, and he collected and distributed charitable funds to the poorer villages who did not have synagogues and therefore did not have ways of taking care of the poor and the widows and the orphans. Unlike other Jewish sages, he was an advocate of prophetic teshuvah, which is a return to God. We misunderstand it as repentance. And he was an advocate of teshuvah, compassion, covenantal love, and interior purity, more fundamental as things than the temple sacrifice or ritual halakha. These things were, in his idea, in his mind, far more fundamental to spirituality and to getting right with God than ritual temple sacrifices or halakha. And unlike other Jewish sages, he was not directly associated with the accepted schools of Hillel and Shammai. He was questioned by what authority he did these things. But like other sages, he taught using Davrim, Mashlim, and his form of spiritual halakha and halakhic rulings. He developed his midrashic teachings or interpretive teachings directly from Jewish scripture, from the Torah and the prophets and the writings. He was acknowledged as a sage, prophet, healer, exorcist, and holy man throughout Palestine. He was very popular. Now, Christians have traditionally regarded Jesus, the Christian Jesus, to have been totally unique, a Jew only by birth, a being who just came out of another dimension and brought entirely new teachings that no one had ever heard of. They think his teachings about loving and praying for enemies transcended Judaism and had no connection. However, modern scholars have recognized that his teachings can be understood only in the context of his contemporary Jewish religious thought and culture. It is in the context of that culture that his innovative genius reveals itself and shines forth. So loving and praying for enemies was in fact a Jewish teaching established during the Babylonian captivity and carried through with synagogue prayers not only down to Yeshua's era but beyond. Prayers for those who had captured them and whose cities they had to live. Well, let's take a look at that. Let's look at the origins of this concept. Now, we need to look at some background in order to understand where Yeshua's teachings derived. Now, according to the Bible, the kingdom of David was established with its capital city of Jerusalem about 1008 before the Christian era. This little map shows what that kingdom was supposed to look like. This is also known as the Kingdom of Solomon, and that spread throughout all Palestine, but you see there are many other ancient nations around it. Now, currently, there's no archaeological evidence to confirm this this extent of an empire, or that it was something really this great, or as it's kept in Hebrew legend. So David's son Solomon succeeded him in about 970 before the Christian era, before the Common Era, and he hired foreign builders to construct the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem. Now, that's because there was no tradition nor any kind of skill of building any really complex things in Israel at that time, and so they had to go to foreign builders. And that's, by the way, the legend that is used by Freemasons about the origin of Freemasonry and so on. So they constructed the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem, and its design reflected all ancient Near Eastern temples. It looked just like a temple that would have existed in any other country, Moab or Edom or any other kind of place. Now, upon the succession of Solomon's son Rehoboam in about 930 before the Common Era, the biblical account reports that the country split into two kingdoms, the kingdom of Israel, or northern kingdom, including the cities of Shechem and Samaria in the north, and the kingdom of Judah, containing Jerusalem, in the south. Now, Yeshua was from the Galilee, which would have been part of the old kingdom of Israel, not the kingdom of Judah. And many of the prophets were associated with the northern kingdom, and before the Babylonian captivity. And much of Yeshua's prophetic inspiration comes from the older prophets as well as the later ones. I've given you a reference here in Wikipedia to take a look at the history of Israel in this way. Now, both Israel and Judah possessed temples or cultic centers for sacrifices to Yahweh, because Yahweh was the God of both of these kingdoms, because they had originally been a kingdom of Solomon, kingdom of David, kingdom of Saul. Now, the capital cities of all ancient Near Eastern nations were cultic centers, and they maintained priests and temples for their gods. So the main cities were the way that ancient nations were organized. They were kind of like city-states, except the main cities had their temple centers where a great deal of wealth was kept, and where the deities were worshipped with rituals, and the deities were associated with those geographical areas. Those were the places where the gods lived. The Greek word for God, theos, is from a root meaning a delimiter of limits, one who sets boundaries. And the old gods were all associated with a certain geographical area. Yahweh was associated with his geographical area, not with his people, but with his geographical area. So the deities that were worshipped in Canaanite religion during the Late Bronze Age notably included El Elyon and his sons, the Elohim, the goddess Anat, and Hadad, the storm god and the heroic slayer of Yam. You can check this, and I've given you an easy link for you to take, which is a good, reliable link. And the composition of the Hebrew Bible began centuries after the Bronze Age collapse, but many of these names are still reflected in biblical Hebrew, including Elohim and the title Baal, originally a title of Hadad, as the rival or nemesis of Yahweh, because different cities or different areas, different ancient nations would invade each other, and their gods would go against the gods of that territory. Now, a main god was always associated with a city, nation, or geographical area. Thus, Marduk for Babylon, Enki with the city of Eridu, Ashur with Assyria, that's how we get the name Assyria, Enlil with Nippur, and so on and so on. Yahweh was the main god of both Israel and Judah, and therefore was the god of that territory. It's not unlike the idea that certain nature spirits control certain places. You go in Africa to a lake, well, there are certain nature spirits that one will give recognition to that are in that particular area. Now, when Assyria conquered Israel in 722 before the Common Era, and its people were sold to different nations as slaves, the people of Israel, it was thought and said and realized that the god Ashur had defeated Yahweh in battle. That was the idea. The gods were the people who led the troops. It's the same thing you find in the Iliad and the Odyssey and so on. I recommend Bloch's recent book for further study. This book, The Gods of the Nations, A Study in Ancient Near Eastern National Theology. That's something you might want to check out. Here I put up a little map of the ancient Near East showing all the different ancient nations that with their main cities. And each of them had their own gods. And the cultic centers, the temples were the place were like banks. There were also treasuries, and the king's wealth was kept there, and the deities were worshipped there, and priesthoods were maintained there. So to continue this background, when the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar conquered Judah and looted the temple of Solomon in a defeat of the local god Yahweh by the Babylonian Marduk, they took the royal family and the priesthood and about 10,000 other families captive and brought them to Babylon, which is known as the Babylonian captivity, which is a massive project begun in about 596 before the Christian era. It didn't happen all in one fell swoop. It happened over more than a decade or so. But when that happened, something very different was done than had been done with Israel. When the Assyrians conquered Israel, very brutally, they took their people as captives, as slaves, and sold them to other nations. And so the Jewish, what we think of as the ancient Hebrew culture and worship of Yahweh and so on, was totally destroyed. It didn't happen anymore. Their culture was gone because their geographical location was gone. So here's a sort of a map of how the Babylonian captivity occurred. The people were taken out of Jerusalem, mainly out of the city of Jerusalem. That would be the rulers and the priests and so on. And they were brought along the trade routes down to Babylon. Now notice that this area in Babylon includes a place called Tel Abib and Nippur, which had been separate kingdoms. Now it was thought that when the people of Yahweh were removed from their geographical cultic center, they had no access to their God because he was geographical, and all they could do was remember Jerusalem. But the Babylonians were what we might call beneficent rulers. Unlike the Assyrians, instead of just destroying people by selling them off into captivity, they let them live and kept them and respected them and kept them in a community, allowed them to prosper if they wished in a community of people and to keep their own culture, and later on to even return and restore their own deity in their own temple. So we have in Psalm 137, for example, a song of lament for the people, because all they could do, they had no access to their God. He was back in Jerusalem. That was where he lived. So they would, in the psalm, for example, we find, how can we sing Yahweh's song in a foreign land? That means, how can we do Yahweh's rituals? How can we sing psalms to him? How can we worship Yahweh when we're in a foreign land? Because he's not here. He's not with us. Now, the prophet Ezekiel, who was a priest from the village of Anatot, who, after the captivity, lived in Tel Aviv by the river Kebar with his wife in what is now Iraq. Look at the little red circle, you'll see where Tel Aviv is. He was a very famous prophet, and he received Jewish pilgrims from Babylon to get advice, because he was, as I say, a very famous prophet and a seer and so on. And it was there that Ezekiel saw his vision of Yahweh riding in a Merkaba, or the chariot of a warrior king. Now, warriors, kings who went out to battle, they brought their thrones with them on a chariot. And it was hauled by other people, and the king would oversee the battle. In fact, very often kings, like the Pharaoh, for example, of Egypt, is always portrayed as a giant person, and all the other people going out to battle are little people that are going along and pulling him along, because he personifies that kingdom. So here is Yahweh personified now as a warrior king who is able to move. In the vision, he can move to the north and the south and the east and the west. He's a movable God. He's no longer stuck in one location. He, in fact, is no longer tied to one geographical location or even one temple. This is the prophecy, the insight that Ezekiel brought to the people in Babylon. Yahweh was now revealed as the God of all the world, above all the other gods, and he could be worshipped anywhere, in any place. And that became the basis for the idea of the Hebrew culture now becomes a Hebrew religion. It's now something that can be practiced and done not just at the temple with animal sacrifices, but anywhere in the world. And it opens up the development of what became the synagogue and the diaspora life of Jewish people all over the world. It's a very significant vision. It's not just an ascent to the throne of God. It's a vision that God is the God of all and superior to all the other gods. And he's available anywhere and everywhere. It's really the beginning of monotheism in Judaism. So we say that many scholars say that true Jewish monotheism probably dates from this vision of Yahweh as not merely the local God of Judah, whose house was in Jerusalem, but the universal God of all the world. And the message was that the Jews of Babylon could access their God anywhere through prayer and singing of sacred psalms, and later through study of Scripture, and that temple sacrifice was not the primary thing. Now, this is an orientation that Yeshua was very familiar with living in the Galilee. The idea that, the temple of Jerusalem was a long, several days journey to go somewhere, but God was still accessible here. And the idea that God was accessible through prayer and singing of psalms, etc., and that animal sacrifices and things were not primary, not necessary anymore. So this became fundamental to Jewish identity and worship in the diaspora, and to the organization of synagogues or assemblies, independent of temple sacrifice and one geographical cultic center. So soon after Ezekiel's revelation, prophets of the captivity in Babylon tried to foment violent uprising against Babylon. This is a very complicated history, but they saw an opportunity to overthrow the rulers in Babylon in order to be able to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple and all this sort of thing. So these prophets tried to organize a violent uprising against Babylon. Now, the prophet Jeremiah, the son of Hilkiah, who was possibly the high priest, and like Ezekiel, who was from the village of Anatot, he was still living there, he sent a letter to the Jewish community in Babylon in the name of Yahweh, advising them not only against violent revolt, but to pray for the benefit of their enemies, their captors. Here's what he said. You can read it in Jeremiah 29:5-7. And Jeremiah is a very complex piece of history that you really need to study in order to understand. But he says to them, and their advice as a prophet to the community in Babylon is, build houses and dwell in them. Plant gardens and eat their fruit. Take wives and beget sons and daughters. And take wives for your sons and give your daughters to husbands, so that they may bear sons and daughters. And he's actually advocating intermarriage. That you may be increased there and not diminished. And this is very important. And seek the peace of the city where I have caused you to be carried away captive. I, being God, Yahweh, has caused this. This is not a defeat of Yahweh. Yahweh planned this. I have planned it all along. Ha ha ha. And seek the peace of the city where I, Yahweh, have caused you to be carried away captive, and pray to Yahweh for it. For in its peace you will have peace. Wow. So God is saying, hey, there's a method to this madness. I had you carried away for various reasons. Eventually I'll bring you back. And so I want you to settle there and to make your home there. And I want you to bless the land. And I want you to bless the rulers. And I want you to pray for them. The message was that Yahweh had caused them to go into exile to purify them, but that he would later bring them back to Jerusalem. Now, ever since this time, Jewish worship has included prayers for the blessing of the government in whatever nation they reside in the diaspora. Usually it's done after the Torah reading, but before the scroll is returned to the Ark of the Synagogue. Here's an example. A prayer for the Queen and the royal family, our Sovereign Lady Queen Elizabeth, Elizabeth the Queen Mother, Philip Duke of Edinburgh, Charles Prince of Wales, and all the royal family, blessing, blessing, blessing. So this started out by the prophetic advice to bless those who captured you, bless those who are your enemies, because I, Yahweh God, have caused this to happen, and it is my doing. And you should learn then to bless these people. So Yeshua was very familiar with the blessing for King Herod that was done in the synagogues of Roman-occupied Palestine, because this blessing has been kept ever since that time. In every Jewish synagogue, the government is blessed where people live, no matter what nation they live in. And Yeshua would have been very familiar with the blessing for King Herod. And who was King Herod and who were the Herodians? His enemies. He was very familiar with that blessing because it was done in the synagogues of Roman-occupied Palestine. Now, I want to point out that Yeshua agreed with the prophets, and especially with the prophets Jeremiah and John the Baptist, about enemies and about rejecting violent overthrow and revolution. The blessing of the Roman Herodian rulers was undoubtedly recited in Galilean synagogues at the time of Yeshua, and he himself recited it. He advocated for similar peaceful endurance in all his teachings and activities, just as Jeremiah had. It was Herod who had executed John the Baptist, and the Herodian enemies of Yeshua who tried to entrap him and finally succeeded in having Yeshua executed, and yet he prayed for divine guidance and a reformation of his enemies. The prayer for the enemies is that God would guide them and that they would act with justice and compassion, etc. So the way of dealing with enemies is not to try to destroy them, not to try to fight them, not to do all this sort of thing, although you may have to defend yourself. But it is to pray that their hearts might be healed and reformed, and that they might join with those who are following the good impulse, the good Keizer, etc. That's the approach to enemies that Yeshua advocated. Now, he never advocated violent revolution against Roman occupiers, but like John the Baptist, advised living in peace. And here's what it's reported that John the Baptist told people, even though he was saying that the Messiah is going to come, the kingdom of God is going to come at any time. He was an eschatological apocalypticist. Even though he said all that, this is what his advice to the people was. The crowds asked him, John the Baptist, "What then should we do?" In reply, he said to them, "Whoever has 2 coats must share with anyone who has none." Where did we hear that? That's also the teaching of Yeshua. And whoever has food must do likewise. Where did we hear that? Teaching of Yeshua. Even tax collectors came to be baptized, and they asked him, "Teacher, what should we do?" He said to them, "Collect no more than the amount prescribed for you." He didn't say, revolt against the taxes. He didn't say anything like that. What he said was, do your job, but do it fairly and honestly. The soldiers also asked him, "And we, what should we do?" And he said to them, "Do not extort money from anyone by threats or false accusation, and be satisfied with your wages." In other words, keep peace. Be peaceful. Now, hoping to force Yeshua into supporting tax revolt so he could be charged and taken to court, or forcing him to support the tax and thereby make himself hated by the general population, because the poll tax was the tax of the Roman officials on the people was very much hated. The Herodian Pharisees challenged Yeshua with the question, is it right and lawful to pay the poll tax? Meaning, right, is it just and lawful? Does it make sense with Torah to pay the poll tax? Very clever question. He's damned if he does, he's damned if he doesn't. But Yeshua told them to hold up a tetradrachm with images of Tiberius and Augustus, such as we show here. And then he asked, whose image is engraved on this coin? And they answered, Caesar's. He then ruled, render therefore unto Caesar the things which are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. Very brilliant ruling, because he cannot be accused of being a Roman collaborator. He cannot be accused of being a revolutionary zealot who wants to kill all the Romans. He says, but more than just that, it's more than just a clever answer. What he says is that there are 2 things going on in the world. There's Caesar's world, the world of Caesar, that you have to live in, and you have to make peace with it. He says it the same thing in many ways other places. For example, he says when someone accuses you and wants to take you to court, make peace with him before you get to the court, because you might get put in jail and take a long time before you ever get out. He gives this kind of advice to one. But he says there are 2 worlds. The world of Caesar that you have to make peace with, and the world of God. And the world of God is your world, and the world that you make peace with is the world you live in. So Yeshua was a peacemaker, and he advocated peace, and he did not advocate violent revolution. In Yeshua's view, the Roman occupation was part of the birth pangs of Messiah, requiring commitment to preparation and interior purification, which were spiritual. Violent revolution would oppose the greater divine purpose of the Abba, just as Jeremiah said, violent revolution or attempt to do it, even though people who claim to be prophets were saying God said they had to do it, that he was saying, no, this would be wrong and stupid. It would go against God's purposes. Instead, make peace, bless the people, and pray for your captors. So now we want to take a look at a very ancient synagogue prayer that was said in synagogues in the first century, the Amidah, and especially the Birkat HaMinim, the so-called blessing, but it's actually a curse of the Minim, the heretics. In Judea, the Pharisees had developed a synagogue prayer of 18 benedictions or blessings called the Amidah that today is now condensed into 12 from modern synagogues. The benedictions probably date from the earliest days of the Pharisaic synagogue, which developed after the Babylonian captivity and continued since then. And it gave Judaism a way of being a religion that was not necessarily just by genetic or family inheritance, but one that could also be a religion that could, where proselytes, new people could be taken in and could be circumcised and made part of Israel. And these benedictions probably go back all the way to that several centuries BC. I'm giving you one Wikipedia. I like to use Wikipedia links because they're really easy to get to, and I always vet them, and the ones that I think are good and academic are the ones I give to you. Here in this wiki, the person who writes it says, the benedictions were at first spontaneous outgrowths of the efforts to establish the Pharisaic synagogue in opposition to, or at least in correspondence with, the Sadducean temple service. Because remember, the Sadducees were the sons of Zadok. They were the ones who supposedly had the main right to serve as the high priest in the temple, and that's why the Sadducees were in charge of the temple. So these benedictions are probably quite old, and they existed for a long time before the time of Yeshua. But in the first century, a 19th prayer was added by Judean Pharisees, which functioned as a curse against heretics or internal enemies, the Minim. Let there be no hope for the Minim, and may all the heretics and all the wicked instantly perish. May all the enemies of your people be speedily extirpated. And may you swiftly uproot, break, crush, and subdue the reign of wickedness speedily in our days. Blessed are you, Yahweh, who crushes enemies and subdues the wicked. Well, that's a little different kind of blessing, isn't it? It's really more like an imprecation or a curse. And this was later altered to include the Christians, or the Nazarenes, the Natsarim, and the government in the Palestinian Siddur, which became pretty nasty. For the apostates, let there be no hope, and let the arrogant government be speedily uprooted in our days, and let the Natsarim and the Minim be destroyed in a moment, and let them be blotted out of the book of life, and not be inscribed together with the righteous. Blessed art thou, O Lord, who humblest the arrogant. So this is the Birkat HaMinim. Now, scholars dispute whether the Birkat Haminim was added to the Amidah before or after AD 70, when Rabbi Gamaliel II is reported to have either added or updated from an already existing benediction among the 18, whose content spoke out in general against separatists, to incorporate explicit mention of the heretics or the Minim. So there is a dispute about whether that would have existed at the time of Yeshua, but it undoubtedly did, and that would explain why the ancient Palestinian rite numbered 18 benedictions that included the cursing of enemies. It's reasonable to conclude that Yeshua was familiar with the Judean cursing of enemies in regular synagogue prayers. So here's Yeshua. He would be very strongly opposed to any kind of a curse or cursing. And in his teachings, he strongly emphasizes that. And yet he's exposed to two things. He's exposed to the blessing of the Herodians, of the enemies, in synagogue. He's also exposed in Judea. Only in Judea, only in the Judean synagogues do we find this Birkat Haminim, this cursing against the enemies done. It's a very different kind of thing. So this is something that he does not approve of, does not like, and it's characteristic of Judea and Judean Phariseeism. According to the prophets, the Olam Haba will be characterized by the peaceful coexistence of all people. And we must remember that Yeshua derived his view of the Olam Haba from the visions of the Jewish prophets. Hatred, intolerance, and war will cease to exist. Yeshua spoke against hating. The laws of nature will change so that predatory beasts will no longer seek prey, and agriculture will bring forth supernatural abundance. We've looked at an authentic saying of Yeshua preserved in Papias about a time in the Messianic age when we'll have giant fruits and vegetables and things like that. All of the Jewish people will return from their exile among the nations to their home in Israel. This was a common teaching of the Messianic age that Yeshua endorsed. The law of the Jubilee, that is, all debts being forgiven every 50 years, will be reinstated. Well, that would be great, especially for a lot of people now that have student loan debt that should be forgiven. It's not done. Debt follows you here in the modern world until you drop in the grave, and then your heirs get to deal with it. But the law of the Jubilee will be reinstated. And what is that law? It's the law of forgiving debt. Forgiving debt becomes synonymous with sin, and the idea of Gilgal and reincarnation and so on. And Yeshua very strongly supported this view. The whole world, in the view of in the interpretations of the Messianic age, will recognize the Abba, that is Yahweh, as the only true God, and the Jewish religion as the only true religion. And that is what was done. Now, in Yeshua's interpretation, that meant that God is universal, the new humanity is universal, and therefore this is the root of true religion, true spirituality. Not that it's the old Judaism or the old Hebrew religion or temple worship, but rather that it is the new spirituality of the Messianic age. And this is what Yeshua taught. There will be no murder, robbery, competition, or jealousy. There will be no sin. And because there's no sin, sacrifices in the prophecies of the Messianic age say that the sacrifices will continue to be brought to the temple, but these will be limited to the Thanksgiving offerings, the Todah, the vegetarian stuff, no animals being killed. They will be limited to the thanksgiving offerings, the Todah, because there will be no further need for expiatory blood sacrifice, because there's no sin. These are all concepts that informed Yeshua's teachings that became teachings uh, of the love of enemies, the blessing of those who persecute you, and so on. God will dwell with humanity, and, quote, I will pour out my spirit on all people. Your sons and daughters will prophesy. Your old men will dream dreams. Your young men will see visions. Even on my servants, both men and women, I will pour out my spirit in those days. And we must remember that Yeshua's teachings were included men and women as equals. That's why Paul said in Christ there is no male or female. There is no distinction between that. So Yeshua's vision, however, excluded hatred of enemies, and certainly the very idea of the Birkat Haminim promoted by Judean Pharisees, the idea of cursing your enemies. And that is one reason that he attacked the Judean Pharisees for their, quote, laws of men versus the laws of God. It was at this point that we find his innovative spiritual genius creating midrashic interpretation that went far beyond the existing rabbinic schools. At this point, Yeshua really kind of goes far into the kind of genius that has made his teachings endure. For example, you have heard it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth. But I tell you not to resist an evil person. If someone slaps you on your right cheek, turn to him the other also. If someone wants to sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. These are teachings because they're illuminated by his vision of the Messianic age, which is now infiltrating and being prepared by the birth pangs of Messiah, and the Malkuth of God is now coming into humanity, and the new humanity, the Bar Enosh, is being realized within human beings on earth. So when Yeshua interprets how all this affects scriptural midrash, he will make an absolute comparison that you have heard it was said, meaning you have heard among the conservatives and the heartless and the non-compassionate, and especially among the Judean Pharisees, eye for eye and tooth for tooth. Let my enemies be destroyed. But I tell you not to resist an evil person, and so on, so on. So you see, there are many different influences that point to these things. They're all Jewish, they're Galilean, they're not Judean, and they're classic, prophetic, and messianic, that all are brought together by Yeshua and rebundled in a way that becomes universal. So, to love, to bless, to forgive, these are Yeshua's innovative teachings for the Messianic age that derive from Jewish teachings and derive from his Galilean background, and but also are developed in his genius and his great heart to become the true teachings, understanding the true laws of God, the true teachings of God, which are based on compassion and so on. Very different kind of God than the ancient gods of the ancient Hebrews. So the sacrificial God, the local God, the deity who demands forms of service and justice and so on. This has all evolved over centuries, and Yeshua's concept of God, the Abba, is very different than even the concept that Jeremiah was putting forth, or Ezekiel. And So in all this, Yeshua is an extreme liberal theologian, so to speak, but still rooted and based in the same thing that all the conservative theologians of Judaism were basing themselves in, but in a whole different modality, a universalist modality. Now, Yeshua's teaching to love your enemies, and I'm putting that word in quotation marks because we're going to have to qualify that. To love your enemies, it alluded to the biblical ahav of the two great commandments, but implied the Hebrew concept of chesed, a term meaning covenantal love. His innovative interpretation of covenant, which is the ancient agreement between Yahweh and Israel, was elevated to a greater covenant between the Abba, the universal Godhead, and all humanity through the Baranash, or the new humanity now coming into being or bringing itself into being. With the coming of the birth pangs of Messiah and God's sovereignty or Malkuth on earth that Yeshua proclaimed in his Basar, Yeshua taught that covenantal love is now required in all relationships, not just with Jews and Israel and God, but in all human relationships. In fact, we might even today expand it to say the relationships between humanity and the earth and its environment. But all relationships, there is a covenant in marriage and family and among strangers and even with mortal enemies. We are brothers and sisters, and there's a covenant between us. And that is kept alive by covenantal love. Well, now, what do we mean by covenantal love? Love, ahav, or hesed, is what was done, not necessarily emotions that were felt. To love an enemy was to treat him with respect and mercy. It wasn't the Christian idea of having warm, fuzzy feelings about someone, or that one must try to manufacture false loving sentiments for an enemy. It was what you did. You treated him with respect and mercy, no matter what they've done. It was a commitment to covenantal love for an enemy that was clarified in other statements, such as to do good to those who abuse you and do not return evil for evil. It's what you do. You don't return evil for evil. You do good to those who do harm to you. So Yeshua regarded returning evil for evil as a means of self-bondage and multiplying sin. It was not a solution to anything. The following that we're going to look at are separate sayings arranged in a logical sequence by the redactor of Luke's Gospel in the so-called Sermon on the Plain, which is parallel to Matthew's Sermon on the Mount. And these statements appear not only in Matthew, but some of them separately in various New Testament epistles and Papias, and summarized in the Didache, chapter 1. And here's what we have of these teachings. Show covenantal love to your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who abuse you. To one who strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also. And from one who robs you of your cloak, do not withhold your tunic either. Give to everyone who begs from you, and from one who steals your goods, do not demand them back. And as you wish that others would do to you, do so to them. Now, we find that in Luke 6th chapter. It's roughly similar in that order to the Marcion's Evangelion, as it's been reconstructed. We find it in the 5th chapter of Matthew, the so-called Sermon on the Mount, and Papias, and in Didache, the 1st chapter, and many other places. Undoubtedly authentic teachings. The meaning is to bring yourself into being as a Baranash, you must keep the commitment. This is the halakha. You must keep the commitment to always respond to others with fairness, justice, compassion, restraint, kindness, and generosity, regardless of how badly they abuse you. That's the teaching. Love, blessing, forgiveness. Now, in early Christian tradition, a great deal was derivative from Yeshua's covenantal teachings. They were not understood in quite the same way, but we'll take a look at them. The first we're going to look at is the Didache. Now, the Didache is a document that was probably developed and expanded over the whole first century, probably as early as the AD 30s, soon after the execution of Yeshua and the formation of Jewish congregations, Jewish Messianic congregations, and it was added to and changed and edited all the way up to probably AD 90 or beyond. But in the very first chapter, the Didache, which seems to be very, very ancient, here's what we find. There are two ways, one of life and one of death. This is called the two ways doctrine of Deuteronomy, and it's a Jewish teaching. But a great difference between the two ways. The way of life, then, is this. First, you shall love God who made you. Second, love your neighbor as yourself, and do not do to another what you would not want done to you. This was Yeshua's ruling on the two greatest commandments. Love, ahav, that means to have compassion for, and so on. And of these sayings, the teaching is this. Bless those who curse you, and pray for your enemies, and fast for those who persecute you. For what reward is there for loving those who love you? Do not the Gentiles do the same? This is probably from an early Jewish manual. But love those who hate you, and you shall not have an enemy. Abstain from fleshly and worldly lusts. If someone strikes your right cheek, turn to him the other also, and you shall be perfect. The term is tam, complete upright. If someone impresses you for 1 mile, and the word here where it's asks you to travel with him for 1 mile, go with him 2. If someone takes your cloak, give him also your coat. If someone takes from you what is yours, ask it not back, for indeed you are not able. Give to everyone who asks you, and ask it not back, for the Father wills that all should be given of our own blessings, that is, of our own free will, or our free gifts. So here we have a very early Christian take on these very authentic Jewish teachings. The New Testament writings used the Greek word agape to represent the Aramaic Hebrew concept of covenantal love, ahava or chesed. The Greek noun agape first appeared in the Septuagint a couple of centuries before the time of Yeshua, referring to the covenantal love that God had for Israel. The agape, or love feast, that early Gentile Christians derived from the Jewish Todah, was a Hellenistic form of community memorial or charitable feast sponsored by guilds or private organizations for special events such as a death anniversary. And this became the common meal of the Gentile Christians and the diaspora Jews, the Greek-speaking diaspora Jews, who had converted to Messianic Judaism. So Christian agape and the concept of a new covenant or a New Testament derived from Yeshua's teachings about universal covenant. So that's where the teachings of love and blessing and forgiveness, so emphasized by Yeshua, derived. So for a patronage of $2 or more per each of these lectures and presentations, if you pledge that for me online, you'll receive PDF files of books featured in this series and passwords to Wisdom Seminars courses commensurate with your level of support, depending on how much you give. You can read about that online. So please click on the Patreon link in my description just below the video to become a patron, helping to sponsor my new videos on the pre-Christian teachings of Yeshua. And thank you.